Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Bi-alogue. Tonight it is B to the T. We are talking about the intersections among the bi plus and trans plus communities, the issues that face us all, at least those of us on this panel, and from which we hope everybody can draw a little bit of information and inspiration. With us tonight is going to be Professor Guin Davis. He's a professor of ethics and political philosophy at Howard University, or they are a professor of ethics and political philosophy at Howard University. They've been the co-chair of the Community Advisory Board for the University of Maryland Prevention Research Center for LGBTQ mental health since 2020. Earlier in their career, Professor Davis also worked closely with HIV, STI testing, and community education, psychosocial support programs, and case management. Davis is also the founder of Not Black by Choice, LLC. Professor Davis, tell us a little more about yourself.
Hello. It's always weird hearing other people read like things about you that you've done because it sounds like fiction, but like, oh, like I really have done those things. Sure. One of my like major interests is in terms of teaching. I mostly teach ethics classes. Ethics is one of those areas that I find is intimately grounded in the myriad of different experiences that we kind of have on a day-to-day basis. It's entrenched in our everyday lives as far as our family members, our relationships, our friendships, our political affiliations, our religious, our spiritual ones. And it always ends up being one of those things that we can never genuinely escape as far as how we view our responsibility to one another, as well as how we kind of maintain accountability for ourselves and what that means for kind of developing relationships. And it is through that lens that I've continued to, it's through that lens that I've continued to expand my like understanding as well as my research into queerness and my own philosophical examinations into myself, into my community, as well as using all of those things at my disposal to continue to expand queerness as much as I possibly can to make sure that there are boundaries that are respected, but also ones that are pushed that needed to be pushed.
All right. Also, thank you very much. Also with us tonight is Capri Campeau, an actor, writer, and queer content creator based in Los Angeles, fueled by a passion for telling LGBTQ plus stories that make people feel seen and make them laugh. She has amassed a following over 400,000 and reaches millions of people every month with their content. They were listed as one of Bi.org's bisexual creators to watch and has created a digital course called I'm Bi, So Now What? To continue her mission of helping bisexuals feel confident and proud to be bi. Capri, welcome, and tell us a little bit more about you and what you do.
Hi, I'm so excited. Of course, you make me go after Davis. I was like, hey, I'm gay on the internet.
Tough room. No, everybody's friendly here. Go ahead. Yeah.
No, I'm just so honored to be around so many bicons and around so many people whose work has impacted me so personally. It's just so fun. And Tara, I literally have your book like right here that you signed.
Okay.
So yeah, I'm so grateful. And I'm just so thankful that we have our beautiful community, and I'm really grateful for the community that I've built online and just the path that has been paved by our beautiful bisexual ancestors. And I'm just grateful to be here.
Right on. Okay. Then we'll also welcome to the chat Ladyboy Gigi, a certified sexologist and sex coach. Gigi has been active in the bisexual community since the early 1990s and published The Dominance Handbook, an intimate guide to BDSM in 1999, and was awarded the AIB Global Award for outstanding service to the bisexual world community. Gigi, along with Michael Page and Wendy Curry, started Celebrate Bisexuality Day. That one, we all know that one, September 23rd. Gigi was a co-producer of After Hours, Queer Radio with Attitude on KPFT 90.1 FM, a radio program on human sexuality. Currently, Gigi produces a podcast on iTunes called Adult Bedtime Stories. Gigi, tell us more about yourself and some of your current work.
Yeah, basically, when I first came out and I was very young, I didn't know much about sex. And I kind of had to discover the hard way, the school of hard knocks. And it was some hard knocks at times. And so part of my life vision is to create a more sex positive world where we have accurate, explicit sexual information for young adults so that they aren't going into it blind, so to speak, but really you're going into sex with some skills and talents. And so I'm putting together a bunch of um, sexual education video training programs. And one of them is, that I'm really proud of is the body image healing program, because we grow up in a world where we have all these Hollywood images that are picture perfect humans that no real human being can live up to or become. They're airbrushed, they've got hairdressers, they've got um, choreographers, they've got lighting experts, they've got makeup artists who can have a whole crew follow you around and make you look picture perfect all the time. And so part of my vision is to help us overcome this Hollywood vision of beauty and develop a more realistic vision of beauty. And I think for me, part of it was body image. Growing up intersex, I didn't know if I knew I wasn't a real boy, and I knew I wasn't a real girl either. And even at 5 years old, I snuck into the girls' bathroom to see if that felt better. And it still felt like, no, I don't belong here either. And so I grew up with a lot of body image issues that needed healing. And so that's a big part of what I'm doing today is working on helping people overcome some of these issues and really love your body as it is. Because we are beautiful energy beings within a physical form. We're not just uh, flesh and blood. We're so much more than that. And yet Hollywood just brings it down to the physical. So that's it for now.
All right. Well, thanks, Gigi. Thanks for the insight. And we'll be touching on those issues a bit more later as well. And then, of course, once again, we have our own. Well, just a moment. I have to get my cheat sheet out here. Not that I really need it, but I'm going to use it anyway. So Cassie Brighter is a writer and public speaker focusing on sexuality, diversity, and women's empowerment. She is the creator of oursensualselves.com, a global sex positive community of women. Cassie's a frequent guest on podcasts and presenter at conferences on the topic of sexual consent and boundaries, relationship dynamics, and authentic living. A woman of trans experience, Cassie brings a unique perspective to conversations about relationships and personal identity. Welcome, Cassie, and tell us a little bit more about yourself and what you do.
Thank you, Terry. I'm really happy to be here among these stellar speakers. And mostly, I'm right now, my time is divided between two different initiatives, very different initiatives. One is focused on women's sexuality, and the community keeps growing. I'm at 4,300 right now, and it's about to grow over 5,000 by the end of the year. And so that has its growing pains and whatnot, but it's going really well. And then separately from that, I've been focusing a lot of attention on working with parents of trans kids. I have another community that has just under 5,000 parents, where we talk about all the challenges that face families with trans kids, especially in today's climate. We have a really regressive climate with this really interesting, I think is the euphemism I could use, of a Speaker of the House that we just got. A lot of families are dealing with fears and with anxieties. They're relocating from one state to another. So that has its own challenges. In the middle of this, I'm launching a course over the course of the next couple of days. And then I'm going to focus on writing a book for an intro guide for parents who are new to the trans experience.
Right on. Thank you very much, Cassie.
Mhm.
So let's go to learn a little bit more, go a little bit more in depth with each one of you here. So, Guin, you're an educator. You teach philosophy.
That's
Has
what they
your
told
personal experience
me.
as a bi and non-binary person
Mhm.
influenced how you present the subject in any way?
Oh, 100%. If there's one thing that I've found that it's well on just like on base level as an educator and as someone who's worked very intimately with communities, my teaching style, or rather my pedagogy of sorts, is really centered around my students themselves. And so I always take stock of who's in the room the first day. First day like introductions are always like a kind of asinine thing, but and very kind of traditional to do, but I do it and give my students the opportunity to present their pronouns to me, to present to me how they want to be identified, and so on and so forth. And it gives them an opportunity to know that they have a queer professor in the room, an openly queer professor in the room, but also they have someone that they can trust to acknowledge them and respect them in the way that they want to be acknowledged and respected. And I will say that my queer students are in my queer, non-binary, and trans students are in the minority for the most part in the classroom, but there is always an opportunity for them to make themselves known. And by doing so, I really continue to kind of ground myself at the same time. And so as I kind of approach the content in the course, I always try to make sure that I'm curating it to the experiences of the people that are there. That it doesn't matter if I'm talking about some old white man from like the 1800s and their theory, right? It's a matter of making sure that they're able to apply the things that we learn, or the things that I teach them, or the things I expose them to their lives in particular, so that they can have a better grasp and a better understanding of how they're supposed to navigate for themselves. And even as a professor, I always remind them that my duty, my job is not to change their minds specifically. I'm not there to indoctrinate them into anything that they're not willing to learn more about. I'm just there to expose them and at bare minimum give them the devices necessary to kind of sharpen their own knives and their own minds, so that they can, better articulate themselves, if nothing else, and like provide themselves with the opportunity to think more critically about their lives and how they're situated amongst the rest of the world. And so by providing myself as a very open queer resource for them, by not only sharing my own experiences with my own like queerness, regardless of whether it be my gender or my sexuality, it softens the room a lot more, right? So I would say that as far as my gender and my sexuality go, it's been very monumental in creating a safer space for my class. Yeah, for my class. That was like three different words, but just for my class. And watching how they respond a lot more authentically in the room because of that, how they feel safer to be a lot more honest with themselves, a lot more honest with me, sharing things with me that I honestly did not anticipate. I don't anticipate most days. Sometimes certain things you aren't ready to hear at 8 o'clock in the morning, but it happens. But nonetheless, like just creating that context for them up front really drives the energy for the rest of the semester and for even the rest of the school year. And for some of them, the rest of their academic careers. I've had some students who just continue to try to have a class with me just because they enjoy the space that's being created through that framework.
Would have liked to have a couple professors for you like you at my time in the philosophy department at KU, frankly. Cassie, let's get you back in the mix here. I noticed that one of the things that I kind of knowing a little bit about your personal history, we go back a bit of ways here. A lot of your current career in writing and sex and relationship education has sort of come to you. You have pursued this after beginning the process of gender transition. So my question to you is, how much of your work has revolved around your own understanding of the your sexuality and your gender identity, and how those two come together?
One of the key things that I found is that there's a before transition and after transition for me, but it's not so much in the topic of gender. It has to do with the topic of being a quiet conformist and keeping myself outside of the radar, and breaking out of that. I had to burn my life to the ground in order to transition. And I experienced a lot of shunning and experienced a lot of closed doors. And I went into it with very few illusions that it was going to go splendidly. And so one of the great virtues of that is the fact that I emerged from it no longer giving a damn. There's a sentence that has kind of become a little bit of a mantra for me. I don't know if this is Marlene Dietrich or who said this, but there's nothing as freeing as a ruined reputation. And the moment that my reputation was burned to the ground, I kind of was reborn, and I was able to reinvent myself. One of the things that emerged out of that is longer and longer written rants. And I was surprised to find that people enjoyed reading them, and that led me to writing about all kinds of topics, but exploring a lot about what does it mean to be a woman, what does it mean to topics about sexuality and whatnot, the dynamics. Nowadays, I think that labels are for soup cans, and that a lot of us overspill our labels and overspill our cubby holes. And something that kind of fascinates me lately is this supposed binary distinction between cis and trans, and to what extent that's questionable, and how many people are straight by default, for example, because of fear of exploring anything else, and how much people are clinging to labels. There used to be a time when things were defined really, really solidly. And I mean, one example is the whole born this way narrative kind of forced the separation of, like, there's gay and there's straight, and both transgender people and bisexual people are really inconvenient to the born this way narrative. And I think that there's a lot more fluidity to things. And so that's something that I'm really interested in lately, exploring all of those things. To take a step back for a second, the way that I came to my sexuality as a 17-year-old is I slept with a boy. I remember thinking, I think that I like boys, not this boy, but other boys, perhaps. Then I slept with a girl, and I thought that was also kind of okay. And then I slept with another boy, and I came out of all those three experiences saying, well, which is it? Would somebody just point me in the right direction? And that was very confusing. So I'm happy to say that in my early 50s, I'm beginning to sort shit out.
I know you're ahead of me. I'm also in my early 50s, and I got no idea what I'm doing. So, so Gigi, you're bringing a couple more intersections to our discussion today. Not only are you bi and part of the trans community, but you're also intersex, and you're also involved in the world of kink. How have those intersections and sort of affected your understanding of your sexuality and your gender identity?
Basically, when I came out of high school, I was ADHD, really ADHD, and dyslexic back in the 70s school system, where they hardly knew what that was. And needless to say, when I came out of high school, my self-esteem was almost nothing. I hated myself. I thought I was never going to amount to anything. And I started on this journey of questioning. I had a friend that said, you have real negative mind talk, and you need to check it out. Ask yourself two questions. Where's this coming from? And is it true? And on top of all that, I had a lot of issues around feeling like I didn't really fit in as a real boy. I mean, The all boys club didn't want me. The all girls slumber partners, slumber parties, they definitely didn't want me. And I thought, where do I fit into all this? And as I started checking all this out, I discovered that, well, first of all, sex is much more fluid than I ever thought. I took a human sexuality course in college, and that's when I discovered that I was intersex. I went down all the conditions that they listed and checked off just about, I think, all but one. And I said, oh my, nobody ever told me. And this was at 23, I discovered this. But I always kind of knew deep inside that I wasn't quite what they were trying to make me be. And I remember principals and coaches just having the hardest time to drill into me that I'm a real boy. And I got punished. I had one principal that set up a corner in his office because I was in there so often. And by going through this healing process, it kind of led me to the path of being a sacred harlot. I run Aphrodite's temple for pagan groups and for BDSM groups. And part of my healing process was going through BDSM role play and reliving some of the traumas of my past. But this time I was armed with safe words. Little kids don't get safe words. And that was so empowering to the inner child that was so scared and so beat up, not just physically, but emotionally. And I remember back in high school, I was afraid to walk home alone. And so I finally figured out, okay, I'll pick the biggest guy. And I'd go up to him and I'd say, I'll be on the other team if you walk me home and be my bodyguard. And so I figured out ways to keep myself safe. But it was partly, and BDSM has this kind of interesting paradox. The day I started giving my power to someone else was the day I became empowered.
Mhm.
When I was trying to hold on to power, it was like I'd lose it. It'd just run through my fingers. But by surrendering, I gained power. And it was through BDSM role play. And that's really what got me into kink, was healing some of the issues from my childhood, because I had a father that was a minister, and they caught me playing with little boys in the woods in this little small town. And I was like, it was bad. They started sending me to these cures. They sent me to one church where they spoke in tongues, and then they sent me to a church camp, and that totally backfired. Wound up, 3 girls got pregnant, none by me. I took condoms. But it was just everything in my childhood was, they were trying to fix me. And it was through BDSM I was finally able to fix myself.
What you mentioned, I mean, with where you sort of, it is, kink is a way that a lot of people can take control of their sexuality in their life for the first time, and so this is a common thread among people who embrace kink, and there you go, you're right there amongst them. So, and thanks for sharing and giving us that insight into yourself. Now, Capri, you are our representative from the land of Hollywood. You are an actor, and as such, you are down there in the trenches fighting for roles, and you get to see up close some of those folks who get the roles that maybe should go to someone else, maybe not. How do you feel about portrayals of bi plus and trans plus characters these days? How can they be improved, and what other sorts of observations might you have about that?
I love this question because talking about bisexuals and non-binary folk in media is like my favorite thing to do. I think, well, and here's the thing, I'm also trying to do this while also being respectful of the strikes. I'm not trying to talk about any struck material, so bear with me if I just like mute for a second. I think the most beautiful thing that I've seen growing up is the difference between sort of two-dimensional like bi characters, where you have like women that would be like exotic in some way, you can't really describe it, and you know, they're here for a good time, not for a serious time, and that's like their and that's it, that's all that you get from them, and then they're gone, and then they're here for 3 episodes and you're like, whoa, she kissed a girl and no one's ever going to talk about this again. Okay, fine.
And she liked it.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
It was a character building moment. But now she knows what she really wants, and it's a strong white boy who lives next door. That's the whole thing. So so I think growing up with that, and then now seeing tales and shows that have like, you know, bisexual men who are, oh, the SAG strike literally just ended. Oh my God, Robert, shut up. No way. Okay, I guess the strike's over. So, but seeing, I've been watching Gen V. Now that the strike's over, I'm gonna switch it up so fast. Gen V, and there is a character who is a bisexual man. I know, that's right. He's a Black bisexual man, and they talk about his bisexuality like immediately. Like immediately, he talks about another guy that he finds super attractive, and he's also like with all these women and like pulling the most gorgeous people, and that's also not the most interesting part of his character, and not the whole thing about his character. And then you have, you know, you have Heartstopper, you have all these like really, really fully fleshed out bisexual characters, and you have Sex Education, where you have really beautiful showcases of like what being non-binary looks like, and also how it like impacts relationships, and being like, hey, I'm non-binary, so like how do you feel about this? And also like, how do you, this is what I'm okay with in a relationship, and this is what I'm not okay with in a relationship, and seeing people who love similarly to me and identify similarly to me have standards is something that I did not watch on television for a very long time. And being someone who's in this industry, it fueled a passion for me to start creating those stories, which I was able to do over social media. And now, you know, being in LA, like making those films and pitching those series and being like, hey, if you're not going to make this, I'm going to make this. So it's been really inspiring to me, and really fueling. And I literally could talk about this topic for like 2 days, solidly 2 days, could talk about all my favorite Bi characters.
We'll have to do a Bi-alogue solely about bi representation, and Heartstopper.
I'll just send you voice notes. I'll just send you voice notes.
Capri, another trope that's very common is the fact that another trope that's really common, Capri, is the fact that the girl leaves the man for another woman. Such as, for example, in this wonderful movie called Imagine Me and You, which is a great movie, but there always has to be the broken-hearted dude somewhere in the picture.
And it's always the like, oh, what gender are they gonna pick? Like, oh, now we're gonna figure out, are they really gay or are they really straight? Because like no one's ever solidly bisexual and happy in media, so it's really cool to see that changing.
And in a lot of like Black media, bisexuality becomes villainized through the whole DL trope, and it creates a whole other narrative that we have to deal with in a way that is almost irreparable at this point, because it becomes such a cultural staple for so many people that it's created this weird box, but less of a box, more of like a cage that people willingly sit in, even though there's clear evidence to the contrary.
Right on. Let's sally forth, shall we? Now that we've solved all the problems in Hollywood. So we live in interesting times, which is you know, not always an asset to us. But with political attacks against trans and non-binary people on the rise, how might being bi, pan, fluid compound those difficulties faced by us trans plus people? What are some of the pitfalls that we face in those in these new identity politics wars?
Dylan Mulvaney just came out as a lesbian, and the immediate reaction from a whole bunch of people is that I don't know, like it nullifies her transness. It's really bewildering how they can't, and this has been put forward to culture for quite some time now, the fact that gender and orientation are separate tracks, and yet we keep conflating and we keep finding this thing, which is like, wait a minute, I thought you were trans. Then how come you don't like boys? And it's like, it's nothing to do with it.
Oh my God. No, I can't.
Fortunately, I like everyone. My orientation is anybody who asks nicely and looks cute.
Yeah. Is there a formal term for that? Is,
how many times I've had to like explain that to people?
I'm an equal opportunity lover.
Right. Like
I like that.
to echo that a little.
That's a good title for a song.
Like Cassie, I cannot tell you how many times I've had to explain to people that like the gender and sexuality conversation happens together so much that people think they're one and the same at every point in time. And one of the issues that a lot of trans people face is that like kind of monosexual kind of lens through which they're viewed, or like trans women are still viewed as men and are still treated and like understood through that. And when trans women are attracted to cis women or even other trans women, then it becomes such a weird deconstruction of that kind of that initial binary that's just set up where everyone's supposed to fit in. But if you can't get in where you fit in, then it just falls apart altogether. And one of my favorite things about that is like, I remember some years ago, I had done like an interview with like one of my people that I went to grad school with, and she was working for, I forgot what company she was working for, and she wanted to interview me about bisexuality. And it was interesting because I forgot the question, but it was basically asking me about bisexuality. And I gotten so fed up with receiving the question to the point where I just said that in order, like a lot of people tend to want bisexuality to conform to this kind of linear notion of this prefix of bi meaning two. And I'm like, okay, well, if that's how you want to conceive of this, then bisexuality is going to be an attraction toward things that are masculine and things that are feminine, or it can be an attraction towards things that are most like you and things that are most unlike you. This if you really want to satisfy these two categories, then you can create those categories in that regard. And it satisfies, and even though I did it out of frustration, intellectually speaking, it opened up so much more space for people to exist as being bi or being bi plus. And inevitably, it helped increase an understanding around what bisexuality legitimately is. And that's also partly because like a lot of rhetoric that I've encountered over time in very like academic spaces and like regular social spaces and some like kind of advocacy spaces was that bisexuality conceptually was very limiting. It's very confined to the heteronormative binary and sorts. And I think that, and this may not be a nice thing to say, but I think that that's just blatantly wrong, right? And I'm being generous with my wording. Like, I think it's blatantly wrong to conceive of it in that way, largely because it removes a lot of the opportunity to think beyond a structure that has been imposed on us for so long that we've already seen doesn't satisfy the like number of people that exist outside of the binary that's already created, but also people who function outside of that binary. And when you were talking about like labels earlier, I always get into conversations where I don't think that labels are terrible things. I think that labels are very useful, and I think that other people believe that they're useful because we, you know, in a very technical way, we use labels to navigate our world all the time when it comes to like identifying the tree versus identifying the cat and the dog. But the misappropriation of them and the misuse of them, and like in the same way that a tool that can be used for, you know, whatever utility or for good can be used in a way that's abusive or harmful or oppressive, labels kind of function in that way. And the way that we are able to conceive of and use and create more of that meaning that doesn't continue to confine people and continues to expand their ways of like being with others is like almost the essential thing that is necessary when it comes to understanding how we relate to all of these different kinds of things, especially when it comes to being bi or being bi plus, and kind of removing the stigma associated with heteronormativity that some queer folks often place on it, and that also, you know, cis hetero folks also place on it as well, and continuing along this like pathway of liberating our language from not only the stigma, but also the kind of the ways in which identity and ways of existing have been politicized solely for the comfort of those who are made uncomfortable by the deconstruction of that binary.
Really interesting example that I found is that the Greeks did not know the color blue. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that they weren't able to see the color blue. They just referred to the sea as bronze colored because they lacked the vocabulary, they lacked the nuance because it wasn't part of their fabric mixes. So sometimes language really sets us in the wrong path. There's many examples right now. White privilege is one example where people just completely misunderstand that and take that in the wrong direction. Toxic masculinity, people are like, well, are you saying that the masculine is toxic? No, we're saying that there are specific aspects of masculinity that are toxic. Anyway, along the same line, I think the word bisexuality also gets a little bit tumbled and confused by folks. And I struggled a lot with that because, well, that's one of the reasons why I was more drawn to the word pansexual, because I encountered people that used bisexuality in that really limiting way, Guin, that you're referring to. And then I felt like maybe I'm excluded from that. They would be saying bisexual in the sense of like, well, I want the masculine man or I want the feminine woman. And I felt like, well, so am I looking for a trisexual, quadrisexual?
An omnisexual?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, the terms, they really do multiply. You know, everybody, you know, and the terminology, I mean, rolls over every 20 years. So whatever terminology we're comfortable with now or has been deemed acceptable here in 2023 will be completely retrograde and reactionary in the mid 2040s. And if we're fortunate enough to survive that long, we're going to have to deal with a lot of chastisement, I imagine. But
yeah,
you know, speaking of, you know, challenges that we face being both bi and trans, how about advantages that we face being both bi and trans as we pursue our careers in activism and other aspects of our lives? What are the benefits of the special perspective being at the intersection of bi and trans identities have granted you in your work and life? Positivity. Come on. We've got
That's a good question.
I'll go.
Go for it.
I remember I go to pagan festivals, and I remember for years we sat around the campfires talking about the feminine mysteries, but never was the masculine mysteries ever mentioned. And being intersex, I kind of feel like I'm a bridge between the masculine and feminine mysteries. And I wrote a paper on this a while back, and I think partly why we don't talk about masculine mysteries is maybe in part due to circumcision. When we expose the male and have it all out there, the gland, that hits us at a subconscious level, I think. Not only did doctors perform reassignment surgery on me as an infant, but they also circumcised me. And it took me 1.5 years, but I slowly stretched the foreskin back and restored it. And it was after that I realized, oh, part of the masculine mysteries is having a treasured hidden part of ourselves that we can reveal to others that makes things so much more mysterious. And so that was part of the blending of the masculine mysteries and the feminine mysteries for me. And that's a very physical application, but it also hits us, I think, at a psychological level.
Right. In terms of the benefits of being trans, it's something that I'm only beginning to discover 6 years into transition, because one thing that I felt really strongly as I was transitioning is in the same way that I felt really obliged, and this speaks a little bit to Gigi's ideas about body image and what we consider attractive and whatnot. I had this really specific idea of who's supposed to be by my side, who's supposed to be holding me by the arm before I transition in order to legitimize me as a man. And then post-transition, the first partner I sought out was a 6'3" cowboy from Wyoming. Because I was trying to make a point. I was trying to gentrify myself. And then very inconveniently, I fell in love with a 5-foot-tall Asian American non-binary person who liked to wear all of the colors of the rainbow, starting from their sneakers and ending in their baseball cap. And I was like, you're not helping at all. And it really allowed me to confront and deny and defy this need for cis heteroconformity that I carried with me and burned that to the ground. So after that journey, I am now at the position of advantage, because when I meet somebody, they could have an innie or an outie, and that'll be delightful. And they could have breasts or not have them, and that'll be delightful. And it's one analogy that I came up with is the fact that as I recently traveled and I stayed in a lot of Airbnbs, each Airbnb that I moved into was kind of an interesting new experience. They might have stairs, they might have an air conditioner, they might not, they might have a fan. And the pleasure was in the uniqueness and in the surprise. It wasn't in expecting some kind of cookie cutter model. By the way, there's an analogy that I didn't know when would be the right time to fit it in. I'm going to fit it in right now in terms of bisexuality that I often run into in people saying that we're greedy. And I came up with what I consider the best response to that, in the fact that we are wildly accommodating. We are the perfect guest, because whatever you bring to the table, we will eat it. We'll be happy with that. And the picky ones are the monosexuals who are like, no, I'll just eat strawberries, or I just eat spaghetti or whatever. And so that's my response now. It's like, why are you being so picky?
Expand your palate, right?
Yes, exactly.
Expand your palate.
I love the idea of someone being like, oh, are you gay? And me being like, I'm wildly accommodating.
I'm wildly accommodating.
Oh yeah, that's very good.
So let's kind of think, like we hear about bisexuality, and one of the terms, the sort of little terms of, the little metaphors that we have to describe it is, it's a choice that is no choice, right? And I think that, we look at people who are non-binary, agender, gender non-conforming, choose the sort of the descriptor that we prefer or more appropriate for any particular individual. Is there any sort of analogous relationship? It's sort of like a gender presentation or gender identity that is no choice, refuses certain false choices among gender identities and presentations. Does anybody have any observations on that?
Could you repeat that question one more time?
From the top. We'll take it from the top. So bisexuality. How far do you want me to go? Give me observation, sort of the analogous nature of bisexuality and non-binary.
I have an example that I landed, and it applies, I think, more to being trans, but I think it applies also to being bisexual. in the fact that many musicians, especially guitarists, let's focus on guitarists exclusively, they might realize, Jimi Hendrix, Paul McCartney, they might realize at some point, Eric Clapton, that the way that they're supposed to, quote unquote, play the guitar doesn't fit them. It's not quite right. So that's not a choice. But then what do we do about that becomes a matter of a choice. Because I could have, and one of the first thoughts that I had when I finally confronted the fact that I'm trans was I'm going to live the rest of my days with this a secret and that nobody's ever going to know. That lasted about a minute, but it would have been a choice, and it's a choice that some people used to make. In the same way, what do you do with the means that you have available and the environment that you have available? There used to be a time when if you were left-handed, they would tie your hand behind your back. In an adverse environment, you might choose to not play the instrument at all. You might choose to try to learn to play the instrument right-handed. You might figure out that if you reverse the strings and you flip the guitar, you could potentially play it. In the case of Jimi Hendrix, when he became famous enough, Fender gave him a left-handed guitar. So become rich and famous is another way to go, I suppose. But it's a matter of choices. It's the environment, to what extent the environment is hostile or supportive, and that gives you more or less choices. And unfortunately, in the case of trans, as several in the room I'm sure are acquainted with, sometimes the choice is just to exit the game altogether, which is really unfortunate because the choice that's presented to them is really considered no choice at all.
I think for me, one of the things that I've always had a problem with is the way we define sexual orientation, because it's based on a two-binary gender system. There's males, there's females, and then there's me. I'm intersex. So really, where do I fit? There's no opposite sex for me, and there's no same sex for me. And it's also based on attraction. And it's a very limited form of attraction that I'm attracted to boys or girls. Now, attraction, I'm sometimes attracted by a smile, whether it's a male smile or a female smile, but smiles can really turn me on. That sparkle in your eye, the way you move. So there's many more forces that I think make up our sexual orientation than just what's between the legs.
No, I agree. I think another thing is like we tend to think of gender as sort of a spectrum these days, which I think is definitely a step up and definitely has its advantages. Like sort of maybe the nodes of masculinity and femininity on a big in a big field somewhere, that we either draw toward or push away from. But another way, I think, we think about the social aspect of gender presentation. You can also look at it as a color palette. When you're building your presentation, when you're discovering your identity, it's not simply where you find yourself or your proper location. It's using the colors and things that express yourself, that express the person you are and the person you want to offer the world. So
that was a big thing for me because I spent 12 years of my life in a monogamous marriage, and my point of view was that having found somebody that I love, somebody that I want to build a life with, and having the sexual cubbyhole checked off the list, it no longer was that important, but my bisexuality was still very important in the fact that I still wanted to be able to, at the very least, say that Brad Pitt is a really handsome man, or something like that. And just having to keep that in was a really big challenge for me. at the time, I was married to a woman, and she had specific rules about the fact that if I were to say something like that, that would be diminishing her. So, and that's, I think it's really silly, and it's ultimately pretty toxic. I recently did a poll in my women's group, and there's 4,200 women in our central selves. And I did a poll, and most women enjoy the idea of watching two men be sexual together. At least the particular type of women that my group has attracted. So, but yet most men are still very, very driven by the no homo paradigm.
Mm.
Most men who had approached me prior to my transition were on the down low, which was something that I was never willing to contemplate. I think that we're limited that way. We live in a society where the feminine is almost encouraged to be more bisexual, and the male is strongly discouraged and seems to lose points for being bisexual.
Yeah.
I think that sort of is consistent with my personal experience, seeing, the bisexual woman is exotic and attractive and adventurous, and the bisexual man is problematic and maybe a little gross, and
secretly
and
gay.
So
I think another part of
that is go ahead.
I think another part of this equation is that when a man sleeps with another man, it's seen as a stepping down in power. Whereas if a woman sleeps with another woman, it's a stepping up in power. And for a man to give up some of his power is a big taboo in our culture.
A lot of these hierarchies are ultimately rooted in misogyny and in just raw, virulent misogyny. Because for a man to penetrate another man, he doesn't lose virility. But for a man to be penetrated, even by a woman, it's considered that he's losing virility.
No, I was going to say quite the same thing or similar thing, that the notion or the kind of psychological habit or practice of penetrating another is one that is seen as one that is like an insertion or a use of one's power, that the phallus is this thing that's supposed to hold all of this meaning in terms of conquest and power and wealth and access, and be this key of sorts to how one accesses oneself. And the feminine or the penetrated, right, they kind of maintain this mutual association of being that which must be dominated, or that which must be collected, or that which must be held as this object that otherwise doesn't have any value, that isn't its own outside of the value of it being penetrated by something. And I think that metaphorically speaking, this isn't something that's consistent, I'm sorry, exclusive to just sex, right? It's one of those things that you can find easily in a myriad of other human contexts. And it's almost as if that idolatry that comes along with female bisexuality, regardless of how it shows up, is largely objectified in a sense. It becomes this object for that male gaze. It becomes this object that is seen as this kind of means of having collected more of that feminine, more of that which can be penetrated, or more of that which can be held in this regard as being nothing more as of an object of value created by how it can satisfy that which can penetrate. And it's difficult for a lot of cis men, for sure, to come to terms with the kind of strata that's created by that binary of misogyny, and how it kind of continues to really curate this space of not simply just oppression in like the kind of like normative sense, but also repression. And a lot of men experience various forms of repression due to this unconscious assimilation into these kind of views that they otherwise may not even have a full understanding of, which makes it that much more difficult. Because even when it comes to like people who are DL, it's like, it's almost as if like, and from a very like psychoanalytic standpoint, that there is this relationship to this kind of like large kind of abstract other that's telling them how they ought to behave and how they ought to kind of present themselves, how they ought to have sex, how they ought to interact with other people. And from that same standpoint of psychoanalysis, the difficulty comes in when they can't meet that standard, and that dissonance between the self and the abstract is the thing that kind of continues to chain people down. And it's unfortunate because, I mean, it's unfortunate for a lot of reasons, but what I'm specifically about to say is that it's unfortunate because it's almost as if no matter how aware a lot of men can become when it comes to that, like the abstract nature of this like ideal that's supposed to mandate that they behave in a certain way, there's still such a difficulty in breaking away from it, because it's almost like it's like when you have lived your life in a certain way, and then it's like for all intents and purposes it's like a mirror, and someone comes and breaks that mirror, and even though you knew it was a mirror, you now no longer have something to look at, and so now you have to like reestablish something. And Cassie, when you were talking about transitioning earlier and kind of going through these various aspects of kind of processing your experience, I thought about, it's funny, as I was talking to a friend of mine yesterday, because she's experiencing a lot of things and going through changes. And I told her, there's this concept called like the death of self. That's something that's very essential to this process of change that we don't have any control over, that we just kind of go through, that to try and cling to old versions of oneself, or to try to cling to old ways of knowing yourself, that trying to return to a sense of self, or a way of being yourself that in a very technical and fundamental way is inaccessible because it now exists in the past, to try and kind of regain some sense of understanding of self, is almost futile. And it's really harmful when you kind of get down to it, because regardless of whether it's one's gender, whether one's sexuality, or even how one fits into this kind of heteronormative structure, once you start to move beyond those things, to try and return to them is a nostalgia, right? It's like the literal breakdown of the word nostalgia is just like an aching, a longing to be back home, but the home's not there anymore. It's a broken home. And so this kind of, I can understand this kind of sense of abandonment that one feels from the life that they've known, as they're trying to transition into a life that they, for all intents and purposes, ought to live in some, or at least have the freedom and the peace to be able to live. It's understandable for sure, but I struggle to accept it as being the way that it ought to be, right? Because we shouldn't have to go through the struggles that we do in order to just be who we are. And we shouldn't have to advocate and argue for bisexuality, for sure. I don't dislike doing it, but it's one of those things, like when you kind of like take a more meta standpoint, it's like, wow, we really have to socially, politically, and ideologically, spiritually have to advocate for this position of life that isn't really hurting anyone specifically, but is one that just is an expression of the very human experience that we have, that we gain from being amongst other human beings.
If we just look at, I'm thinking of around this room, there are parts of this room that are 100% absolutely dark, and there are parts of this room that are very, very bright, but everything else is shadows. So it's much more likely that most of the population is in some gradation of a nuance than anything else. By the way, something that you brought to mind, Guin, is the fact that I'm very grateful to Cardi B and to Megan Thee Stallion for the fact that they introduced a different kind of paradigm where the woman engulfs the man, where it's us taking, we're writing, and we're in a much more powerful position. By the way, I showed that video to my daughter, my teenage daughter, the Mega Thee Stallion video. And I said, what do you think? And it was really cute to see her struggle with the words and her saying, like, I support how empowered she feels.
Just gave her an existential crisis.
Yeah, but it's not intuitive for us. We always think in terms of penetration. We don't think in terms of engulfing. We don't think in terms of swallowing. We don't think in terms of the fact that the action is on us to take in rather than somebody subjugating us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
It's interesting. I interestingly enough have a lecture on like sexual morality and like coercion and like the concept of using other people. And this semester when I gave that lecture, one of the conversations that we kind of spread into was this notion of penetration, quite literally, and sex being something that is usually done to partners who are penetrated and not done with them, that there's not a lot of agency that is offered to people who experience penetration during sexual intercourse or even just sexual experiences. And we got into like a very long form conversation. I was very proud of my students for this, but we got into a very long form conversation about just how when it comes down to our view of sex, sexuality, gender, and so on and so forth, a lot of them are, of course, very grounded in like misogyny and in some very deep-seated ways, but also that when it comes to a lot of just sexual understanding and sexual like imagination, for all intents and purposes, the quote unquote average person, it's very like phallocentric. It's very centered around this phallic object that is supposed to either be the desired thing or be the standard for how sex occurs. And inevitably, it puts a lot of people at a disadvantage in how they kind of express themselves and how they're able to exist as sexual beings, because not everyone has a phallus and not everyone desires a phallus. And if you somehow are, and if you're somehow a non-believer of like the religion of the phallus, right, you become a heretic, you become isolated, alienated, ostracized. And it's almost as if like, unless you can be shown as a thing of value to the phallus overall, then what value do you have? And the way in which those things show up for us socially and they show up for us in our relationships it's kind of scary, but it's also kind of funny at the same time, especially when you're like really, really aware of it. Like I remember I had an ex-partner, and I had to like be very explicit with him that like when he talks about sex, he ought not to talk about it in a way in which, because he was a penetrator, like he shouldn't talk about it in terms of using terminology that only referred to someone who is being penetrated as the one who's being, effed or whatever, right? Because it didn't take into account that concept of engulfment, that you feel as though because you are the phallus that is performing an act, that you have the power to say that you F someone else, but you never consider the fact that maybe you're the one being F'd, but your phallus is the only object that is used to do that. But conceptually speaking, that's the only thing your mind goes to.
I'd like to jump in here because I saw a study a while back. They took 50 men and 50 women, and they had them each draw a picture of the phallus and the vulva. Do you know how many got the phallus right?
All of them.
All of them. You know how many got the vulva right?
Only
Like
the
10.
women.
Half of them.
Two.
Whoa.
Two. I mean, we don't even know the female, or I'm speaking collectively, but mainstream America does not know the female anatomy.
Yeah.
And
Something
that's
similar
sad.
that I recently saw is the fact that they counted they just took a bunch of medical books and they counted how many times the word penis showed up, and they counted up to 2,000 instances. And then they took that same amount of pages and books and they counted how many times the word vagina showed up, and it showed up 710 times, meaning that there's 710 vaginas for every 2,000 penises. And then they counted how many times the word clitoris showed up, and showed up 82 times.
Oh, wow.
So about 1 in every 10 vaginas have a clitoris.
Let me say, I think what we're at right here, we've covered a lot of the personal and a lot of the physical. Before we go to audience questions, maybe let's take one more dip into the professional before we move along here. I'm going to start with Capri and tell us that well, first of all, I'd like everybody to offer something they're working on, something that we're offering, to the world in our professional lives that perhaps the people in the audience may or may not want to partake in. So Capri, what are you working on? What can you tell our audience about that they might benefit from?
I launched a Patreon like a month and a half ago, and it's a bisexual centered queer space. And I make longer form videos on being bisexual, based on what my audience has been asking me. And it's a really sacred, beautiful group, and I love it. And I'm grateful to have the community, and I'm also excited to be able to have like a more vertical impact with people versus just a wide impact. I feel like with social media, I can impact so many people wide, but the checking in and having deeper conversations and being able to continuously help isn't something that social media often offers. So I'm really grateful for that. And I'm also writing a script for a short film that I'm working on, centered around what we were just talking about how so many people are comfortable with the conversation of sex when there's a phallus involved, but like what to do when there's no phallus. I remember right before I was with my partner, my girlfriend Angel. She's my first long-term relationship with a non-man, and right before we visited each other in person for the first time, because of course it's our long distance because we're queer, I was like on Tinder searching for any girl to hook up with me because I was like, I do not know how to do this without a penis involved. Like, what do I do? And so just I'm so excited for that script and so excited to make that film, and excited to continue bringing queer chaos to your phones.
Capri, what's your Patreon? The address? If
you just look up my name, Capri Campeau, or if you're on Instagram at Capri Campeau, it's like in my bio. But yeah, Capri Campeau, Campeau.
And if you'd be so kind, maybe type it into the chat so some other folks
of course,
can maybe access it directly through there. All right. Cassie, what you working on? What's coming up in your professional world?
Well, I was hoping to have my app finally launched, Our Sensual Selves, but it's dragging on. Apple is giving us a hard time. So for now, you can find us at oursensualselves.com. And from there, you can go to the Facebook group. It has about 4,300 women. It's a women-only space, but I'm also working with Sex Positive World, and that can be found at sexpositiveworld.org, and that's a multi-gendered space. And we're giving lectures on a number of things, finding your voice in order to voice your desire. I continue working on consent and boundaries. I developed a class on naughty talk and how to be able to verbalize the things that you want and the things that you don't want. I came up with an acronym called Mermaids, and so in every conversation, I recommend that you discuss your mood, your expectations, your relationships and your relationship expectations, medical, things that you want to avoid, things that you are indifferent to, and things that you desire, and safety protocols. So mermaids, all in all. And if you contact me at Cassie@CassieBrighter.com, I'm going to put that in the chat. I can send you the one sheet that I have for that.
Super. Guin, what's coming up in your world? How can we follow you and your work?
What's coming up in my world? A lot of grading. No, but as far as my world is concerned, I will say that currently I'm reworking Not Black by Choice, which is a company that I developed to give bi plus folks of color and of the community in general different ways of expressing themselves and kind of showcasing everything about themselves, from their bisexuality to their asexuality to being aromantic to being pansexual and so much more. I've been working on the website a bit. I've also been working on some new clothes for the website. It is a clothing store, and I have some really cool designs that I can't wait to pop back out. I'll make sure everyone gets access to those things when they are ready. But in the interim, you can follow me at Not Black by Choice on Instagram and on Facebook. I mean, I do have another Instagram, but that's my cosplay Instagram. But so that's completely different. But otherwise, in the interim, until those things are ready, I actually am working with one of my students who is a graduating senior on their thesis. They are actually writing a thesis about how biological determinism is a poor model for understanding romantic love because it excludes queer relationships. And so helping them develop their thesis in that regard and using social determinants to be a better framework through which to understand those things. So I guess most of my work right now is very intimate with the students that I work with, but the more I guess business driven work is still underway. It's under construction over the holiday break.
Okay, thank you, Guin. And Gigi, where can we find you? What are you working on these days?
Basically, I'm about to relaunch my podcast. I took a break from it for a little while. It's adult bedtime stories. You can find it on iTunes and a lot of the Spotify, a lot of the podcasts. But what I'm relaunching with is video training programs on everything from the erotic body map, how to map out your erogenous zones, and share that with your partner so you can pleasure each other at a deeper level, to things like body image healing and anal pleasures and BDSM and just a whole slew of them. So each week, I do the show about every 2 weeks. So each show I'll be doing either a part or a whole subject area. I know the body image healing is, I think, 4 or 5 parts, and I'll have worksheets and things to download to go along with these training materials on my website. So not only can you hear it on my podcast, but you can download the worksheets and learn how to transform your life and live a more sex positive lifestyle.
Can you share some of your links and information in the chat so that those who are watching can follow up? And then
I just changed I'll give the name of the podcast, but I just changed the podcast host. It's to RSS, something like that. But so I don't have that link, but you can find it on Apple. It's adult bedtime stories, and then my website is ravenslayerleather.com, and I'll put both those in the chat.
And
also reminding me that I also have a podcast. It's called A Little Queer Podcast, where me and my co-host Ashley Whitfield, who's an incredible creator on social media, she's a Black pansexual woman, are your queer best friends that you've never had, and we help you dive into the world of queer joy, culture, and advice. It's really fun and very queer.
Oh, how cute!
And let me give you a quick plug over from me before we go to audience questions. I'm Terry Madison Avery. I run Stack Deck Press. We've got 3 books coming out over the next couple of months. This month we will have the Polyamory Coloring and Activity book for all of you who want to be poly, but have never risen above the level of using crayons. And then we also have coming up a graphic memoir about a woman's participation in the gay games. We also called A Good Sport, and we also have another patented Stack Deck Press anthology. It's called We Belong. It's all Black, all queer sci-fi fantasy stories. All of these are following each other, one after the other. A Good Sport is going to crowdfunding soon on Zoop, zoop.gg. So I'll share that link with you in the chat. And now let's go to audience questions. So let's see, who do we got here? And please, if any of you who are watching, questions for the group or observations you'd like to share, let me know, and I'll go just put them in the chat, and I'll call them out. JD has offered this one to us. Like Cassie, I'm in my 50s, and I'm still fairly recently out to myself and to the world as bi. Imposter syndrome is real. I would imagine even more so for many bi trans folks. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how any of you goes about banishing it from your lives. So it's directed to Cassie, but anybody, what do you have?
I have an answer.
Good.
So my answer is you banish that like bi imposter syndrome by stop trying to define it in the first place. And what I mean by that is if you were to put your bisexuality into percentages, it doesn't really matter how much you lean in one way or another way or any omnidirectional. It doesn't really matter, right? That you're still bisexual. You could be, attracted to one thing more than the other by like 10% to 90%, or it could be 2%. Who gives it? Sorry, who cares? As long as you maintain that integrity, that you know what your attraction looks like on every level, what it looks like romantically, what it looks like platonically, sexually, intellectually, right? What it looks like for you to experience that attraction. No one can take that away from you. And it's going to look different for all of us across the board, not even just everyone here in this call and in this room right now, but just everyone who experiences it. And it's going to look different. And it's okay for yours to look different from mine and different from someone else's, because there is no singular way in which to be bisexual.
That's very good. And the idea of deconstructing, see, that's something really worth capturing, that a lot of people who start wondering about their gender wonder if they might or might not be transgender, because there seems to be a really big divide in between. And instead, if you just look at it as gradients, there isn't anything. There's probably nobody on the planet that's 100% cis. There's probably nobody on the planet who's like perfectly symmetrically trans or something like that. In the same sense, there's not somebody who is exactly bisexual or whatever the definition might be. So yeah, just what was the word that we found? Wildly accommodating. Choose that as a label.
Wildly accommodating task force. It's the new frontier in activism. Mike Schmansky has raised his hand. He has a question for the group. Mike, can you want to share that with us?
Hey guys, I've known at least two of you for decades, and I appreciate your friendships, and it's only recently, and I wonder if that's true. As I get older, I've become, I think, more binary, and I'm not really sure what that means, but I get confused for being a woman until I turn around with my beard, but certainly with the mask on, I'm escorted to the woman's room by a janitor or something like that. It's happened to me a number of times. And all my life I've been confused on the phone by being a woman, and I'm actually very flattered. There was a journalist recently who was interviewing a group of us who were being interviewed for Outwards, and the journalist turned to me and said, "And when have you transitioned?" And I was like, "From what to what?"
Mm-hmm.
But again, I was very flattered. But so I guess what I'm asking is, what does it, I know Capri knows how to explain it, but what does it mean to be binary, and is it true that as people get older, I've just turned 63, do people find themselves becoming more that way?
I personally, again, I think that these labels are best on soup cans. I think that ultimately, there's such a thing as an endonym and an exonym. For example, we all know about the Navajo people, but that's not what they call themselves. They call themselves Dene. and we know about the German people, but that's not what they call themselves. They call themselves Deutsche. So whatever label is right for you, it makes sense for you to wear. But at the same time, realize that labels have limited value. I think that it makes sense that we default to more and more, I guess, conventional kind of frameworks the more that we age, because of the fact that that's what's being just pounded into our heads about the way that we interact with the world. We're supposed to be young and carefree when we're young. We're supposed to be more sedentary and level-headed as we grow older. I don't intend to be at all. But more power to you if you are. But I think because of that, the idea of settling down and becoming level-headed and all of that kind of works against you in terms of just coloring outside the lines. And because of that, you might lean more towards that. Now, I dated a non-binary person for 3 years, and I started defining myself in terms of myself being a binary trans woman. And over time, I kind of rejected that model because I don't believe in the binary as a construct. I believe that the binary, quite frankly, not to get into a whole political thing because we're wrapping up, but I believe the binary was a tool of oppression used by Catholic and Christian Europe to murder and genocide most of the rest of the world.
Yeah.
So I'm not a big fan. But I will say this, which is I lean very, very feminine. So my home is very much on one of the so maybe polarity would be a better way to say it. I'm very polar in that sense, rather than fluid along the middle or in any particular segment of the middle. I don't think that we have the right language yet. I think that we're still trying to build it. An agender person would be equatorial in that sense. We're still trying to come up with the right words. One model that occurred to me is if you have just 2 crayons to color genders with, and of course those colors are going to be red, pink, and blue, right? Or whatever. Okay, so there's 2 genders. But if you come upon more crayons, then you might paint more nuances and stuff like that. And if you come upon a box of 120 crayons, now you got 120 genders. And ultimately, it's just, it's like how many colors does light actually have? There's multiple stuff.
Right.
Now, I think I understand what you're saying in terms of your presentation. Yeah, you could be more conventional and whatnot, but yeah, that's just, go ahead.
Yeah. I think one thing that I realized early on is that gender is and sex is very complex. We all start out in the womb as female, and it's not until sexual differentiation occurs that we start staying either in the female range or start getting some masculine characteristics. And when it comes to sexual orientation, the definition isn't about who you get laid with, it's who you're attracted to. You can be a virgin and be bisexual or gay or straight. It's because it's who you're attracted to, not who you fuck.
Yeah.
We're getting close to
Oh.
Go ahead.
But I just kind of wanted to wrap up with this concept that sex is much more complex than we define it as. And so when you think of it that way, I think that helps us overcome, or help me overcome some of that feeling of imposter syndrome. Because all of a sudden I realized, oh, I'm here to learn. And I don't have it all right now.
We do have one more question. I just want to add something there too, as well, is that I think that there are times in our life where we explore, or times in our life when we nest. And I think that's probably true of our understanding of sexuality and gender, where we look for new things, find new ways to express ourselves, and then at other times we sort of come to rest and grow comfortable in familiar things. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we're any more or less binary than we once were. And I don't think that's necessarily. Yeah. Let me go ahead, and we've got a question from Vitoris here. Let me let me drop this in for you. So thanks for the amazing discussion. What has helped you determine what you actually want to look like in terms of transition versus falling into a new set of beauty standards? For example, being a trans guy interested in men, but knowing they're attracted to men who look like cis men. What groups do you seek to feel comfortable and desired? Anybody want to jump in with that one?
That's been a really big quandary for me because I've always been attracted to the women that Fred draws, and I've always been men that Frank Frazetta draws. And neither of them are necessarily my public as a trans woman. So I've kind of decided to just go by whatever feels right to me in terms of my presentation, rather than what am I fishing for, what am I trying to hook up with, because that being externally driven can only lead to unhappiness. And what I'm finding is that as I've transitioned and as my aesthetic has coalesced into something, and I'm more and more visible in the world, people gravitate to me. And one last thing that I want to say is the Frank Frazetta images are propaganda. We were all raised with propaganda. I was raised with images of almost naked Tarzan. We all consumed Xena, the Warrior's Princess, and we all played with Barbies. All of those are propaganda of a really cis-het, polar kind of binary world.
Anybody else have an observation on this topic? Because we're getting close to the moment of calling it. Gwen, you seem to have something you want to share.
Actually, because I'm kind of going through my own transitional process. So I'm 6'3". I'm kind of large. And I really like working out's one of my favorite things, and something that I had to when I encountered my non-binary nature a few years ago. I had to have like a really intimate discussion with myself. Like, do I have a desire to have bottom surgery? I'm like, well, no, I don't. Not specifically. I don't hate my physical body in that sense. Like, I don't have any resentment towards it in that regard. I'm like, okay, well, what does my attraction to otherness look like? Well, I do have a romantic, sexual, like I have various levels of attraction to cis and transgenders that extend beyond me. But I noticed that one of the things that I found specifically about myself in that regard was that I didn't have this idolatry and admiration for, I guess, the kind of like masculine male form, and I didn't really see that for myself at all, which is ironic because I love to work out. Like, I like lifting weights. It's very stress, like it relieves a lot of stress, but also being randomly strong for things as someone who doesn't need to be strong for certain things it's kind of funny. I find it hilarious, but at the same time, like, I do have this reverence for like the expressions of the feminine and the female form. And so I'm kind of I've actually curated my own kind of transitional process in terms of like I went from having a closet that was full of like so many, like I have a button on now right now, but that's because it has elephants on it, and elephants are my favorite animal. But like having all these like button down shirts and all of these suits and all of these ties and bow ties and all of these other things and like different kinds of boots and shoes that I inevitably stopped caring about. Like, I stopped caring to have them. I just gave most of it away. I just got rid of it all to friends who like either needed it or wanted it or whatever. And now I have more heels, and now I have more things that I love that flow. I have more dusters, I have more capes, I have more shawls, I have more like long Doctor Who like scarves like this one. I have so many things that continue to slowly kind of curate this image of self. Now, while I can admit that physically I'm not where I want to see myself in that regard, to kind of fully embody what I want to, because I have a very specific image in mind, and the image in mind that I use are different forms of kind of like, I always describe to my friends, like when they ask me, like it's like a range, but it's also like a very strict binary in itself. Like, it's either really brilliant black femme academic or anime slut. Like there's no in between. Like it's
Yeah.
like two of those things.
Two genders.
The two
Like,
genders. The two genders. Yes. Two genders.
A black femme
But
academic.
I hate to interrupt, but we're running short of time. So for all for all of you here, I'd like to say thanks to everybody who showed up. Make sure that you share social media links and other links in the chat for those of us who've been kind enough to join us and tune in today, where they can follow you and their thoughts at greater detail and greater length. Thanks to Capri Campeau, Cassie Brighter, Professor Guin Davis, Gigi, and me, Tara, and of course Mimi and the LGBTQ Task Force. Thank you very much, and see us again next month.